Welcome, everyone. Hope you're having a good morning or a good afternoon, wherever we find you in the world. Thank you for joining us today. And we have a great session lined up for you. Today we're going to look at preparing your service operations and governance for DORA. With you today, James Foote. I'm a trusted advisor at the Cloud People and also IRM lead. And we also have Alexander with us.
That's right. Good morning, everyone. Good to see so many people show an interest in this. My name is Alexander Ljungström. I come from Einar Partners, of which I am the founder and managing director of. And a little bit about myself. Very passionate when it comes to the topic of IT operations and service operations. I've worked now in the industry within the ServiceNow space for almost 12 years. Time goes fast. But I'm especially passionate about the cultural components of everything that is related to CMDB, IT operations, CSDM, and of course the topic which we're going to discuss here today, James. So looking forward to doing this in a duo session here. And actually, what is it that we're going to speak about today, James?
Yeah, so today in our agenda, we have industrial trends on IT operations for DORA, mapping of DORA articles to the CMDB, how service operations and application portfolios become critical for DORA, optimizing the CMDB governance and ownership to stay compliant, and how can ServiceNow platform support you in all aspects of DORA. So great topics that we have. But before we get started, let me introduce to you a bit about the Cloud People. For those of you that are new and don't know us, the Cloud People is a ServiceNow elite partner with over 350 certified expert consultants that are mainly based in Europe, but we also have offices in the Americas, in the US, and in Brazil. Here you have a few stats about our organization. The one that I do want to highlight is the smart resourcing. We have an internal platform, which is also available to our external customers, where we go through the different experts that we have and we build teams for the different projects with the exact skills that we need. It's a full transparent platform, and that's also available to our customers to be able to see our consultants, our different resources, and what their expertise are. Now over to Einar Partners.
Yes. So first of all, it's always super nice to be able to do these sort of sessions together with the Cloud People, because we have a long-standing relationship together, and yet again, it is my honor to be able to just brainstorm here a little bit about interesting topics. But who are Einar Partners then? Well, I've always said our sales pitch is pretty easy because we do one thing and one thing only, and that is IT operations in ServiceNow. So anything which essentially falls under the umbrella of ITOM, CMDB, service operations, etc., that is our bread and butter. The reason, as indicated by the name, Einar Partners, we also have a very strong partnership-driven strategy. So we're very happy to work together with you guys over at the Cloud People, of course. But perhaps maybe more relevant to the session today is that we also specialize a lot on the financial sector services. So we're currently working there with a number of banks, of course, DORA is on the top of everyone's minds. So happy to be here today and share some hopefully tangible knowledge, let's say, around this particular topic. It's the first time I'm using Livestorm here, so I think, James, with that being said, should we cut to the chase and get on to the juicy bits of today's session, perhaps?
Yes, exactly. And before we do that, if I'm not mistaken, we have a poll coming up.
Yes.
How far are you in your DORA compliance journey? I'll give you a few moments to answer the question.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see because everyone is speaking about DORA right now, and then to sort of quantify how far are we really on those journeys. This can also be relevant later on here for the webinar. So hopefully people have been able to submit there. Yeah, actively
But also,
working on it.
I personally find that the DORA is also interesting where it is a regulation that is published and with a date that it's going to go live, but
Exactly.
there is still work going on in the
Yeah,
background. So you still have these regulatory technical standards happening throughout this year, which still sort of change how DORA needs to be implemented. So it's a bit of a, you're working on it, but you still don't really know in certain areas what the final result needs to be.
yeah. And you said the next sort of rework or update of these standards is in June, I believe. So it's
I think
still very
sometime
much
in,
ongoing.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, very interesting. Well, I see here now that most of the people here have submitted some replies, so that's very interesting. It seems like there's a fair number of people who are actively working on it, and then also a fair number of people still in the planning stage. Then there's also here, it's a very even split. Also quite a lot
Yeah.
of people where it's not maybe directly relevant to the organization, but still an interesting topic to obviously upskill within. So now let's get into a little bit of the content, and I believe the first part here is largely with me. So I want to start here with, first of all, changing the slides and then explain a little bit and setting the stage a little bit based on our experience working with financial institutions. And by the way, today there might be some of you sitting here thinking, well, we are not directly a financial institution, but DORA is also something which goes broader. So we've seen also other companies, actually even like in manufacturing, where this becomes relevant for various reasons. But nonetheless, irrespective of how you categorize yourself, if you fall in one extent or another under DORA compliance, then we tend to see certain trends essentially. So where most financial institutions find themselves, sort of the starting point. And naturally, this can vary depending on how mature the organization is, how long you work with CMDBs, etc. But in front of you, you have a couple of three core pillars, let's say. And what we see a lot, starting from the left side, is that, well, there tends to be a CMDB, obviously, like go to any financial institution or anyone falling under DORA compliance. And I think it would be difficult to find organizations which has a zero sort of CMDB. But even so, the CMDBs tend to be rather CI driven. And what we mean with that is they tend to be rather oriented towards the infrastructure rather than the service layer. And this is a classic debate. It has been going on for a long time now of sort of having a service aware CMDB, but still a lot of organizations are there today. Sure, they might have some services. Maybe there are even some services which are formalized, but in the end of the day, we see it's very common to have these massive CMDBs with a huge explosion of data, but all of that data is actually lacking context. So that's a very classic scenario, heavily infrastructure oriented, too much data without proper context, really. In the middle here, you see an application inventory. And we often go out to organizations where, sure, there might be an extent of an application inventory, but when we really look from a more DORA-related perspective, and we're going to speak more about that soon, then yeah, the application inventory tends to also there be lacking. Things like business processes, again, back to the services. If there is an application inventory, it can sometimes be rather flat. And again, it lacks that connection to the infrastructure. And another very common scenario that we see a lot is that, well, we have applications, but then to really determining sort of the business criticality of how important is a certain application or service, that's also a rather big challenge, which a lot of organizations are facing. So also there, it can be a bit of a challenging starting point. And with all of that being said, we also then see on the governance side of things, because filling a CMDB with data is the easy part. plug in some integration, start some discovery jobs, and you will see all sorts of things populating. Actually governing this through, smart methodologies, that's where the crux is a little bit. So also governance tends to be a very manual and labor intensive work where there is a lot of reliance on manual processes, and the governance tends to be there not really from a cultural perspective, but just to check some boxes for regulations. And now when we're moving into DORA, then this is not what is enough anymore. So I'm sure that some of you are recognizing yourself in this. And by the way, as some of you noticed, there is a chat feature here in this live storm. So if you have any questions here, feel free to also write to us in real time. But looking then at how will sort of the CMDB and DORA tie into each other a little bit. Well, let's zoom in on the DORA articles from a pure CMDB perspective to start with. So especially Article 8 is relevant here. And one of those sections, which you see on the left side here, is identification, classification, and documentation of ICT supported business functions and ICT tasks and responsibilities. So what does that mean? Well, it's essential when we go on a DORA journey to really start getting serious about mapping out components. So, business functions, depending on the organization, some of you might call it a business process or business application or business capability, etc. That can vary a little bit, but nonetheless, irrespective of which objects we're using, to really map out the hardware, software, system, and application components used to support that. Super, super important. Because with DORA, an inventory needs to take place at least annually. So that's the first sort of section there. Then we have section 3, which is performing a risk assessment during significant changes. And this can, of course, we can be making a case here. Isn't this a little bit more around traditional ITSM and sort of risk assessment? But it goes a little bit beyond that, because with the CMDB then, any major changes, such as in networks or applications, it actually requires a rather thorough impact analysis of that change, especially related to the security aspect of these business functions that I was speaking about before. So again, it's not always just enough with, let's say, a traditional change request, but we have to be a bit more thorough here. So also actually documenting these results for management and auditors to have it available. Moving on here. Yeah,
Alexander, related to the previous one, so sort of a lot of people here are used to the ServiceNow platform, and you're mentioning here changes as part of the normal change management, and there is some risk assessment. So you're saying here that as part of DORA, it needs to go beyond that basic risk assessment done in change, but you need to go more into depth and also look into the security aspects.
That's right. That's right. So it encapsulates the security aspects, which is one thing, and then what we tend to traditionally see is that, yeah, maybe in a normal change there is some mitigation plan, some basic risk assessment, but here it's a deeper sense of impact analysis as well, where the CMDB and all of those potential relationships comes into the picture. For example, to actually being able to export those outputs, for example, and provide to auditors and or do things like service impact analysis, it becomes even more critical. So moving on then, and I'm not going to bore you all to death with like in-depth sort of analysis of the articles, and I bet like if you ask 10 different people, you will get like 10 different answers on this, but this is sort of a benchmark which we have seen working a lot with, also with auditors ourselves. Section 4 here of Article 8, that is really about identifying all information and ICT assets, including the interconnection and dependencies, aka, most of you already know it, it's straight up config management. So what is important here as well is that it's also pinpointed a little bit more thoroughly on things like, for example, firewalls. So actually being able to see how are firewalls configured, again, from a security perspective. Unlike Article 1, which I previously spoke about, that is quite relevant to the business functions, processes, applications, etc. this goes a bit more granular, and again, quite heavily oriented towards the security aspects of things. And it should be noted that we're speaking about the entire estate here. It's not just about some production systems or some of the critical applications, for example, but this goes quite broad, essentially. Not only quite broad, it's the entire estate, including test and development environments and so forth. So that's, of course, a big thing. And then finally, looking at the last relevant section here of Article 8, and most of you have probably heard about this already, then it's actually being able to tie the dependent processes from third-party service providers, IT service providers. And the same here, this is a little bit where service operations come into the picture of actually being able to tie in, well, you know, if we look at a particular service, what are we dependent on in terms of functionalities, in terms of critical functions, etc., that comes from our third-party providers, and being able to actually model this in a satisfactory degree. So there, the note that I always say is how well integrated is really the third-party reliance today? Because most of the time what we see is that, yeah, we know we have an outsourcing partner, yeah, we know we rely on this system, but to really have it documented and properly included and modeled in the CMDB, that's often where organizations fall short. And I guess this also, James, is something you recognize a little bit when we speak about general, like third-party providers, to be a bit more intentional with bringing them into the picture.
Exactly.
All right. So
we do have a question from Joseph. I think it's related to a few slides back. It's regarding ICT support business functions. And he wants to understand what is your interpretation of it, and because the term seems very broad. And do you have any examples in the banking sector of what these ICT supported business functions could be?
Yeah, they tend to be quite relevant to the actual, let's say, customer journeys that various banks are taking their customers on. It could be anything from loan systems to let's say ledgers or whatever it might be. But again, I've seen many examples here. So these ICT supported business function, because of course it is very broad. You're right, Joseph. And when everything is IT, then everything is dependent on it. But what we have especially seen as relevant there is especially this sort of client and customer impacting layer of things. Maybe not so much the technical backend necessarily of business functions, like technical backend systems, but more the front facing, sort of relating to the actual customer journeys that various clients go through. I hope that at least tries to box it in a little bit. But again, there's many examples here. This is just one of them. So moving on then, looking at what does DORA require then from the CMDB, some of the main highlights at least. And then here, there is a number of key areas. One is visibility. So when we say visibility, what we're really referring to then is impact analysis for real. Like previously mentioned, things like business processes and interdependencies there, but also actually being able to quantify, the impact of downtime, cyber attacks, incidents, etc. So that is often the tricky part in this, right? That what would actually happen is true. Like if we get a cyber attack, sort of simulating those scenarios and being able to quantify that. So also very important. Number two, ownerships and governance. So accountability and responsibility. This is for me maybe the huge part of DORA, that we need to be able to perform adequate risk assessments. And this cannot really be done without clearly understanding who owns what. So if we look at a CMDB, if we look at services, business functions, or whatever it is, then truth is that they tend to be very complex. If you look at the entire chain of something, you for sure have 10 different owners, various stakeholders, third-party providers, different teams. If you're in an outsourced landscape, you might have different people involved. So actually here being able to have solid ownership models, and also being able to explain how do we offer certain services and functions and who is ultimately responsible for something. That becomes super critical. And like I previously mentioned, understanding services, so third-party service providers, DORA actually mandates this specifically, that we need to understand the infrastructure that power our application estate. So it's not enough to just have a high-level understanding of, yeah, we rely on vendor X for something. No, but we need to be able to perform proper risk assessment and actually also being able to put certain type of requirements on those third-party providers to, for example, integrate with our CMDB, to be able to tie into the bigger picture of dependencies. And then finally, application inventory. So actually being able to inventorize the entire application estate. So DORA requires an understanding of the entire application estate. So it's not just, as I said before, about selected production systems or mission critical systems or revenue impacting systems, but this goes broadly. Again, often with the perspective of security in mind. And also there, the topic of business criticality becomes extremely important to be able to accurately assess what is business critical applications, for example. Not always an easy task. So these are some of the main highlights. There are many other things as well attached to sort of the DORA and the CMDB perspective a little bit. But if we look then at how can, oh, by the way, I received a very interesting feedback here, what Philip wrote. So almost every business process will be supported by ICT. This is absolutely true. Yeah, that's what I meant before, that it's a very broad definition really, because very few business processes exist which doesn't rely on IT, I guess. All right, so moving forward then. This in front of you is an onboarding approach to kickstart the DORA journey. It's not set in stone. It's just something that we have gone through with some other clients before. But how can we actually sort of onboard the CMDB from a DORA perspective? So the first step here is determining the maturity level, where you currently are when it comes to the application estate. It can start with identifying the critical applications, for example, and identifying as well the business owners and operational stakeholders. And in the next slide, I will break down how you can determine that maturity level a little bit more. The second part here, then we speak more about actually starting to have your services and interdependencies mapped. So applications is different from services. I'm not going to go now into the details of how we define and distinguish those, but some of you on the call, you might recognize that, yeah, an application might be a very different thing from a service, for example. So actually being able to map the services and the interdependencies there, very important. And they're outlining the software and hardware components as well. So bringing in not just the host layer of servers, etc., but also the critical software components. And then third, that's when we see like people are quite far on the DORA journey. It will always be a continuous thing to sort of adding and removing data sources into the CMDB, but also being able to actually create some leading KPIs to measure, are we on the right path towards DORA compliance? So being able to select those KPIs and create dashboards based out of them, super important. To give some examples, it could be, do we have infrastructure which doesn't have any relation to a service, but is just floating in space in a vacuum, for example? That could potentially be a security risk, to mention one of those examples. I see we also received a questions whenever the slides will be shared. So yeah, Sasha else wrote that we normally send out a recording where you can go back to the slides. So also here, the PDF version will apparently be shared. Nice. Okay, so how can we determine the maturity levels then of the application estate? Well, the first step, starting from the bottom here, is, as I mentioned, understanding the application inventory and business processes. Most likely, if you are in some degree of financial sector here, either a bank or maybe a service provider or something, you probably already are here. You already are at this step. the process there is to have a well-defined, and identify the business processes essentially. And also they're starting to broadly identify the application estate. What that actually creates is a degree of portfolio readiness. And what I mean with portfolio readiness is an application portfolio, really being able to break down what is our applications, what is within that estate, and also the organizational readiness, so the business processes there. The second step is what we call the managed state, where we tend to have a little bit more on the governance side, what I mentioned before, ownerships, for example. So having well-defined roles and responsibilities, the life cycle of applications, of services, but also really starting to identify those dependencies. How are applications actually deployed and operated? Where are there potential security risks? How do we decommission things like that? And here it's all about governance. And we see most of the organizations be somewhere between the first and second step here. If we have a good habit of how we manage ownerships and governance, then we're also in a better position to reach the third level, which is how we continuously optimize the CMDB. So actually, like I mentioned, being able to track KPIs. Are we on track? Can we react fast if we see that the data quality is lacking and it would become a problem with auditors, for example? So this is just some food for thought. In front of you here, you see a breakdown of having the services and interdependencies mapped. The CSDM model becomes more critical now than ever. I'm not going to go through it all in super low level detail, but in front of you, you see sort of the holy grail a little bit to the right side, which is to actually being able to see services, to actually being able to see there, how do we offer these services? And then to be able to see what are the underlying systems that is required to support those service offerings. And finally, what is the underlying infrastructure? And not just, again, the hardware layer, but also the software component layer. Some of you might be thinking, well, Alex, this sounds like a huge, tremendous amount of work. And, this takes a long time. And that's true, it does. So the thing with DORA, and we have worked with regulators here, is that you don't need to have all of this fully automated from day one. And as long as you can prove that you have started this journey, for example, through manual mapping, that you have an actual plan outlined for this, then that tends to at least keep the regulators happy. Meanwhile, you are working towards the objective of becoming fully compliant. That's at least what we have seen in the market so far. So let's have a look then at some roadmap advice, and then I'm going to start handing over slowly towards you, James. Yeah, how can we reach DORA compliance then? Obviously, there is no one golden formula here. There is many different ways of doing this, but what we have seen in the market is, for example, one, really start boosting the CMDB governance. So each organization, if you work with CMDBs, you know that there are important attributes. So these attributes, especially related to ownerships. So each organization, they will have different attributes related to ownerships, which they deem critical. It could be contact persons, it could be security responsible persons, it could be supporting teams, etc., etc. So really defining these critical attributes and really being a bit intentional with what we are going to use, very, very important there. Because often these attributes, they need to have a life cycle and be maintained. And we see a lot of organizations wanting to create 15, 20 different ownership attributes, but less is more sometimes, and maybe sticking to a couple of ones, 4 or 5, for example, and streamlining that a little bit. That tends to be more valuable. Now, the second part here is inventorize and map manually. For those of you in ServiceNow, you might know that there is a product called service mapping. And if you already have that, that's great. But if you quickly want to get started on this, then now is the time to at least start mapping things manually. and to start inventorizing all of these applications. You can start the manual mapping on the critical ones, for example, at least to keep the regulators happy. And this also tends to introduce sort of the service operations aspect of the DORA journey. So service asset and configuration management. And again, to get started there, super important. And later on, that's the third pillar here, you can automate and scale this more. So actually starting to automate the dependencies, replace all of these manual mappings with automatic features such as service mapping, involving application owners more closely to being accountable for these dependencies, and also starting to scale all of these interconnections and relationships to more non-critical and non-production systems. So again, this is just some food for thought on how you can reach DORA compliance. And I'm going to give you here an example of a real life roadmap. This was a client that we worked with that the starting point was they did have an application and system inventory to maybe around 70 to 80%. The ownerships was quite unclear. Like it was outdated. It wasn't really given what meant what. So the first step was we prioritized governance. So who actually owns what? Very simple question with a very difficult answer often. Step two, in their case, was understanding how cloud ready the applications are, because it related to resilience. And for them, it was especially on, they were moving a lot of things towards cloud. And for them, what determined a lot of the resilience was whether they were cloud ready or not. So understanding how cloud ready their application were, and then understanding also the underlying infrastructure. Step three was understanding the relation to disaster recovery plans. That's what I spoke about before, being able to show this to regulators. So do we really understand the impact and the cost if something, an adverse event happened? So actually getting a process in place for recovery and impact was hugely important. And then step four was manually mapping a number of applications based on criticality. Now, this is still an ongoing work, so it doesn't end today, but some food for thought around a roadmap. So I've been talking now for 25 minutes, and James, I think you're up here. I'm thinking if we have any quick questions.
There is a question from Joseph.
Yeah, let's see.
Regarding if you recommend any prioritization matrix for starting this activity. I'd assume it's related to a couple of slides back, starting with critical function services and their assets, and then expanding.
Sure. Yeah, I would start with so it's twofold. One approach is starting where it's easier, just to get into the habit of things, but that's more like from the people side of things. So getting closer to governance, getting closer to defining relationships, etc. So that can be a quick win. But if you look at from a business value and DORA compliance perspective, you might want to start with critical functions, for example, that rely a lot on third-party providers, and then from there expand. So now I've been very zoomed in on the CMDB part here, James, but if we zoom out a little bit then and look more broadly, how can the ServiceNow platform support?
Exactly, but I think before that we have another poll, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. So what is the biggest challenge on your journey towards DORA compliance according to you?
Yeah, that's an interesting one.
I think it touches a lot of the points that you were talking about regarding governance and culture. And owning the data.
This is insane. I see here that it's almost like 9 to 10 ratio on the culture and governance side of things. So yeah, shows to tell, right? So
yeah, let's move on to how can the ServiceNow platform support you. Some of you may know, or maybe not, but ServiceNow does have an operational resiliency application. And this application basically goes through a lot of the points that Alexander made. And here are sort of 5 steps of getting started with this operational resiliency application within ServiceNow. And you'll see definitely in the first 2 steps, a lot of the content that Alexander spoke about So you start with defining your pillars of resiliency and also defining your performance metrics. So a lot of what was mentioned earlier, your KPIs, defining your operating model, and then assess your service importance. Again, what are your critical assets? What are your critical business services? Identify and map those services and enabling processes. Identify the impact tolerances for those different services. And yeah, then building relationships with other platforms. So a lot of the data is found within ServiceNow, but you also have a lot of other critical business applications that contain data. And it could be your ERP, and it can be also your quality, your vulnerability scanners, and so on. So leverage the integration hub to get that information. Then also continue on collecting those metrics, those performance analytics metrics for your KPIs. Then fourth, assess your services and business resilience. So monitor your different resilience metrics, automate issue creation, and manage remediation of those issues. Test different scenarios, and that's why you also a bit of your business continuity comes into play here. And complete self-assessments to assess these different business services. And last of all, it comes up to delivering reports and having a live view for different levels of management. I think a key part, and also part that I see in a lot of organizations, is especially when you go up to the executives, sort of you start building reports outside of the platform. You go and fall back onto Word and so on. The problem of that is, and I've seen that in organizations where it goes through various steps of approval and review of these different slide decks. And by the time it actually gets to someone that can make a decision, that data is 2 or 3 months old, which sort of, leaves you sort of reacting instead of being proactive in your decision making. Coming up next, we look at the maturity model. So, of course, and again, picking up on what, not sure what happened there. Picking up on what Alexander mentioned earlier, you have to start with the basics. And for most ServiceNow customers, you start with ITSM and the CMDB. So you go with a basic ITSM implementation and also start populating your CMDB, but don't yet go into that CSDM model. And then when you move to your next step, you start then looking into your CSDM, looking at how you map your IT then to your different services, business services and processes and so on. So you start building those dependency maps. You also start bringing in more functionality and more tooling that can help you discover more of your network through discovery. And then from there on, you build into your service foundation. So here you start populating your CMDB from multiple resources. You start inputting in other data that is relevant, things like locations, suppliers, people. Start assessing the dependencies between these different services, because again, for a lot of things, and you also see that within continuity plans, if things go down, if certain assets or stop working, then a lot of times you are dependent on suppliers and on people to get them back up and running. So having that view all in one place is extremely important. Then we start moving into your operational resilience. So after you've built your foundation, you start maturing your business services. You start bringing in your risk management, your continuous control monitoring, and making sure that you are compliant, in this case to DORA, and you're able to monitor that so that, again, you can react proactively and not reactively if something goes wrong. Using the integration hub to get sources from different tools, as mentioned earlier. And then finally, your last step of maturity, where you sort of start integrating the different processes and the different assets even more closely, start enabling automation to help out and to remove that dependency on people. I don't know if we've got any questions at the moment.
Yeah, I saw there, James, from Joseph here. Does ServiceNow have a tailored DORA module, or is this the general Operas module that clients should tailor?
No, so ServiceNow does not have a DORA-related module at the moment. They do have some work in the pipeline, as I know, but there is no certain date yet of when it will be released. But this is just the general operational resiliency module. But with the next slide, we're going to look at sort of how you can embed the different tools from ServiceNow to get that full picture. And that's also something that you see through this maturity model. You start with an ITSM, but to make sure that your business is resilient and it is resilient and you can cover all your bases, you will need to look at the different aspects, whether it is risk management, whether it is your security related incidents, your vulnerabilities, have a wider picture of all of everything that's going on within your business. So here you have a more global picture of DORA, as some of you may recognize. Around it, you have your main 5 pillars of DORA. At the center, it's the core. And if we think of it as a layered cake, we look at the bottom and you see your CMDB and your function and your foundation data. Again, a lot of what Alexander explained. And again, that is the base for everything. If that is not set up, it makes everything else a lot harder, because if you don't understand what your different business services are, your processes, and also what your critical services are and how critical they are, it makes it a lot harder then to be able to prioritize and to monitor those. And then on top, you add your business continuity plan, and here you can do your business impact analysis, analyze your different assets and the different dependencies of those. And then at the top layer, you have your, let's say, your 2 parts of it. You have your operational resilience, the application we just spoke about, where you make sure that your IT infrastructure is resilient and secure. And then you have your policy and compliance module as part of IRM, and that's where you can demonstrate compliance to the regulators, to the authorities. Then looking at the different, at the 5 different pillars, and we will go into depth into each one of the pillars in the following slides. You've got your IT risk management, but there it's obvious your IRM module. Then you have your IT related incident management, classification and reporting. And here you have your ITSM, but also your security incidents. So you need those 2 parts. Your digital operational resiliency testing. So here is where your pen testing comes in, and where you test your infrastructure for vulnerabilities. So there are modules in the vulnerability response application for that. You can also use your BCM disaster scenarios to test out different scenarios and how you would react as a business towards those. Then you manage your IT third-party risks. So again, your third-party risk management module comes in here. And then lastly, your sharing, your information sharing and arrangements, which again comes in your security incident response module. And here is where you've got in ServiceNow a functionality called your trusted security circles, where you can share securely information between different organizations. Moving on to the individual pillars. So again, your ICT risk management. Here you have, as mentioned before, your IRM risk management framework, your big dependency on the CMDB, and your ITOM service mapping, your application portfolio. And also what's fairly new is your software bill of materials as part of the vulnerability management module of ServiceNow. Moving on to the second pillar, your ICT incident classification and reporting. Again, here, how you classify the incidents. And I think this is especially, but it's a very interesting topic, and I've been more involved in the second pillar in some work with other customers, and where this regulation tries to unify sort of how incidents are classified throughout the financial sector, which brings a bit of standardization. But here, of course, it requires modifications to your ITSM incidents and your major incidents, again, especially how you classify those major incidents. Also, as part of it, it's not only your internal and IT-related incidents, but also your security incidents, your threat intelligence, and you have here your IRM, issue management, and risk events, so your operational incidents here. Then the third pillar, your digital operational resiliency testing. So here again, making sure that you test your own infrastructure, make sure that it is resilient, or you get third parties to do that. And that could be through penetration testing, which can be managed and run through, well, it can be managed through the vulnerability management module. Again, your software bill of materials comes in here as you understand your different dependencies for your different applications. And as I mentioned, something very new, I think recently released in ServiceNow. Your business continuity, again, your scenario testing, your disaster recovery plans and exercises, and putting those into practice. And then your major incident plans as part of the security incident response module. The fourth pillar, your third-party risk. Again, this is a topic that has seen a lot more relevance in the last few years, especially as we've seen more and more cases of people penetrating, or either individuals or organizations penetrating or being able to enter organizations' IT infrastructure through third parties. So it is extremely important now to be able to understand the risk that those third parties bring to the organization, and to be able to have a place to assess that. And that's where your third-party risk management module comes in. But again, all the way back to what Alexander mentioned and a lot earlier, having that dependency map built in so that you know exactly as part of what business service, as part of what process those third parties come in. And also, again, if things go wrong or when they go wrong, so that you know who can provide support in those areas. And the last pillar, sharing of information and intelligence. Here you have your security incident response trusted circles. Again, a really interesting product within ServiceNow, where customers that use the SecOps incident response module have the ability to share, if I'm not mistaken, anonymously information between each other, again, to help each other. If you've detected certain patterns, if you have had certain incidents, that you are able to share that information within other organizations, again, boosting your resiliency and boosting your capacity to be able to respond to those incidents.
Yeah, super interesting, that one, especially on the trusted circles thing.
Yeah, and that's what we have for you at the moment, or at this time. I don't know if there are any other questions, but while we wait for those to come in, I will quickly share with you what we have next. And for some of you, if you're still and continue on being interested in this topic, we have a customer case of ours. I have insurance. We have a session next week, the 12th of March, where we go through how we've implemented a solution in IF Insurance on how they can handle one of the sections in Chapter 4 of DORA. So this is a really interesting case. We also have a poll. Would you like to be invited to this next webinar? Yeah, if you are still interested or want to continue on in this journey with us discovering more about DORA, then please follow on.
And are there any more upcoming events as well, James?
Yes, we also have a few other events coming up. On the 9th of April, how AI can help customer service. That's not directly related to DORA. Then we have Knowledge in Las Vegas, where you will be able to attend a lot of sessions, and I know the topics like DORA, ESG will be a very hot topic at Knowledge, and you'll also be able to find us roaming around Las Vegas. So it would be great to catch up if you're there. And then on the 12th of June, we have a walkthrough of the ESG the ESG application within ServiceNow. Do we have any questions?
No, I don't think any specific. It was very good engagement here during the session here. So thank you all for those of you who submitted the questions. So I think this is like an ongoing thing with DORA, and I think we're all sort of learning it together, the community. So obviously, feel free to reach out to both me and James when it comes to these areas, right, James? And
Exactly.
I'm sure that, as we learn more as we go along here in various customer projects and discussions and workshops, etc., we'll make sure to also share the knowledge with a broader group. So, but yeah, super cool. Then hope to see you
and also for those that joined in late. We will release a recording of this session, so you will be able to follow it or be able to rewatch it later on. I think from both of us, and thank you for joining, and I hope you have a great day.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining.